If you lived before our time, who would you be? What if you could choose from 1,000 yesterdays, when the past was today and the new took your breath away? Who would you be? How would you live? Who would you love? Living every generation before us, remembering for generations to come. The History Channel, where the past comes alive.
In the early months of the Second World War, American submarines, known as the Silent Service, faced a critical problem. Commanders were complaining that their torpedoes were wildly inaccurate and that those that hit their targets often turned out to be duds. The war in the Pacific was being jeopardized and no one knew how to fix the problem. Our program looks at the evolution of torpedoes. From the beginning, they were weapons of terror that grew even more terrifying with each technological leap.
The sea, vast, capricious, teeming with life and with predators. 3,500 pounds of Mark 48 torpedo, an advanced capability torpedo, is being loaded into firing position.
Raise the load line rollers to the surface position.
The line rollers raised to the surface position.
Within its pressure-sealed cocoon, called a tube. The Mark 48 seeks its victims by sound. It can guide itself to the target or can be maneuvered from inside the submarine.
TSC, this is Louisville. Understand, activate LSP.
2 decks above, inside Louisville's crowded control room, there is an air of palpable anticipation.
Our weapons officer make tubes 3 and 4 ready in all respects.
Louisville is closing in on its prey.
Man battle stations, aye, sir. Chief the watch from 1MC, man battle stations.
Man battle stations, aye, sir. Man battle stations.
Captain, sir, passing 175 to the left, 10 degrees from order quarters.
Very well, Hal.
Today's operation has been an exercise. But 50 years ago, during World War II, such actions were a matter of life and death. For 4 years, U.S. submarines patrolled the Pacific under a veil of stealth and secrecy that would be instrumental to the ultimate victory over Japan. At that time, loading a torpedo into position was no drill. It was the deadly calling card of the Silent Service.
We had to do it with the ropes and pulleys. They're very heavy, they're about 3,000 pounds. And if the temperature is like around the equator is 80 or 90, it would be easy to sweat off 5 pounds.
But unknown to those crews who put to sea after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the very instruments with which they hoped to strike at the Japanese, their torpedoes, were dangerously defective. 2 years of frustration and disappointment would pass before submarines would break through the bureaucratic and political barriers to create one of the single most effective weapons of World War II.
Make ready, tube 2.
Tube 2 ready.
Fire 2.
It's been said that the invention of the self-propelled underwater torpedo exerted greater influence on naval warfare than all the world's top admirals and naval architects combined. The first attempted use of underwater explosives emerged during the American Revolution. On September 6th, 1776, the single-man, muscle-driven Turtle, designed by David Bushnell, tried to attach a 150-pound cask of gunpowder to the side of a British gunship in New York Harbor. The attempt was unsuccessful. Over the next few years, underwater explosives took on the generic name of torpedoes, after the torpedo ray, a species of fish that stuns its prey. Another American, Robert Fulton, is credited with the idea of providing mobility to the torpedo, thereby making it an offensive rather than a defensive weapon. His experimental submersible Nautilus was demonstrated in France in the early 1800s, but he could find no military sponsor. There would be few additional developments until the American Civil War. Confederate attempts to run the Union blockade led to the introduction of ironclad ships, moored torpedoes, or mines, and boom, or spar-mounted explosives.
Spar torpedoes got to be fairly common. The Confederates had very little resources, but they had a lot of trees. So if you took a tree and put an explosive on the end of it and charged the ship and put a hole in it, below the waterline, it sank. So spar torpedoes were an appealing weapon for the Confederate Navy.
The Confederate submersible Hunley used a spar explosive to destroy the Union ship Housatonic in a daring attack off Charleston, South Carolina in 1864. The Hunley became the first submarine to sink a warship in combat, but her gallant crew sacrificed themselves in the effort. By the end of the Civil War, it was evident that armor, powerful explosives, and the submarine had brought an end to the glory days of sail-powered wooden warships. In 1868, Robert Whitehead, a British naval propulsion engineer, introduced a sleek new underwater weapon that he originally intended for use in harbor defense.
The thing Whitehead brought was the idea of running it below the surface of the water. It became a stealthy weapon. But how do you get the power to run it if you don't have access to the air? He solved the propulsion problem by using a compressed air engine. In other words, you just took air and pumped it in up to 1,000 pounds per square inch or something like that in a tank, and then let the air out and use that air to run a small engine. And the engine turned to propeller.
What Whitehead had developed was in fact an underwater missile. His torpedo contained its own propulsion and directional control and could run at a predetermined depth.
That's one of the most remarkable pieces of absolutely intuitive engineering that I have ever heard of. He figured that out with no mathematical knowledge, no analytical knowledge of how the thing worked. It was just his engineering instinct. It was called the secret.
Whitehead's secret was a pendulum, which, depending on the amount of outside water pressure, was activated to sense the up and down pitch of the torpedo and move the depth rudder accordingly. The Whitehead torpedo was designed to be launched from surface ships. It became an instant sensation among the world's naval powers. Curiously, the United States would be the conspicuous exception. In the years following the Civil War, the American military demobilized as national attention focused on Reconstruction. Nevertheless, in 1869, a specialized naval torpedo station, the first in the world, was established on Goat Island at the entrance to the bay in Newport, Rhode Island.
When the torpedo was developed in Europe by Whitehead in the 1860s, the American Navy was slipping into its dark ages. And the number of ships we had during the Civil War diminished significantly. We went from 600 ships down to maybe 100 operative ships. Everything was on hold. And that's why, in a way, when you look at this torpedo and its development here, it stands apart from everything else naval that was happening in this country.
Research primarily involved conventional spar-type torpedoes and explosives, such as those used in the Civil War. But soon, Newport was developing a self-propelled torpedo similar to Whitehead's. The resulting automobile fish torpedo was tested in 1871 with disappointing results. The hull leaked, and the compressed air flask for the rotary engine was not airtight. The first American attempt at a self-propelled torpedo never went beyond the experimental stage. The Navy made annual requests to Congress for funds to purchase automobile torpedoes like Whiteheads. These requests were regularly denied. Consequently, the creation of self-propelled torpedoes became the domain of independent inventors and entrepreneurs. Newport was host to dozens of trials and demonstrations, but none of these prototypes found their way into the U.S. inventory. By 1881, almost 1,500 Whitehead torpedoes had been sold to navies all over the world, but the United States did not have a single usable modern torpedo. In 1883, the U.S. Congress finally appropriated money for the Navy to acquire a new torpedo. They turned to John Howell, a U.S. Navy commander who had patented a homegrown design in 1871. 20 years in development, the Howell torpedo was unique in its use of a flywheel engine instead of compressed air propulsion. A blast of steam spun the 132-pound flywheel to 10,000 RPM. Power was transferred to twin propellers through an elaborate array of gears and mechanical linkages.
The Howell torpedo was a superb example of American craftsmanship, artisan capabilities in the 19th century. It's brass, it's beautiful, smooth design. It's a wonder to behold, and some of the mechanical innovations in it are amazing too. For example, the Howell flywheel torpedo, as you would expect with any flywheel, has to run down during the run, but you want the torpedo to run at a constant velocity so you can hit the target. When you look at the Howell torpedo, it's got twin screws on the back end with variable pitch propellers to keep the velocity of the torpedo constant on the run to the target.
The Howell entered service in 1889, the U.S. Navy's first operational self-propelled torpedo. In Europe, Robert Whitehead continued to improve his design. In 1895, a gyroscope was added to the torpedo, which controlled its course during the run to the target. The torpedo had become a guided weapon.
The U.S. Navy started to look on Whitehead's torpedoes since everybody else in the world was using them. Maybe we ought to have some. So the U.S. Navy in 1892 started buying Whitehead torpedoes. But they decided they did not want to be dependent on a foreign country for ordnance. So it was arranged that the E.W. Bliss Company in Brooklyn, New York, who manufactured tin cans, would get the American license to build Whitehead torpedoes for the U.S. Navy.
Torpedoes were still intended for surface ships, but by the end of the 19th century, the submarine had sparked renewed interest. John Holland, an Irish immigrant, developed a successful prototype that incorporated a launch tube for 3 Whitehead torpedoes. It was purchased by the U.S. Navy and commissioned as the USS Holland in October 1900. The submarine had joined the fleet as a torpedo-armed warship. The pace of torpedo development accelerated. After several years of producing torpedoes under license for the U.S. Navy, the Bliss Company introduced a new turbine-powered torpedo for use on battleships and cruisers. It was called the Bliss-Levitt Mark I.
At the same time, Bliss-Levitt was thinking, now that we got this turbine-powered torpedo going, we can make money on it. And they had the Japanese and the Russians and these various foreign countries coming in and looking at the torpedo.
Bliss-Levitt's commercial endeavors with foreign governments alienated the Navy, even while they continued to purchase hundreds of torpedoes. The Navy even sued in court to prevent the release of sensitive technology.
The Navy lost, and Bliss-Levitt got authorization to sell the torpedoes. At that point, the Navy said this will never happen again, and they went to Congress and got the money to build a torpedo factory on Goat Island on their torpedo experimental activity. Suddenly became a torpedo production facility.
But Bliss-Levitt trumped the Navy by introducing yet another breakthrough in torpedo propulsion.
Bliss came up with the Bliss-Levitt Mark 7 torpedo, which is one of the absolute landmarks in the United States Navy torpedo business. It was a so-called steam torpedo because it squirted distilled water into it, made steam, and drove the turbine. Very efficient, very fast.
Steam turbine propulsion became the basis for all U.S. torpedoes until the latter stages of World War II. The Mark 7 torpedo was issued to the fleet in 1912. Despite their earlier problems, the Mark 7 was produced by Bliss-Levitt under Navy direction. In addition to introducing steam turbine propulsion, it was the first torpedo to use a TNT warhead. The torpedo had come of age at a critical juncture in history. Across the Atlantic, a single gunshot in the Balkans plunged Europe into what would become the first global war. Although the sinking of the passenger liner Lusitania by German U-boats helped draw the United States belatedly into the conflict, the U.S. Navy saw little action. The German surface fleet stayed close to home and thus presented few targets.
The number of torpedoes fired by the United States Navy in World War I was very, very small. As a matter of fact, the number of torpedoes fired in combat by the United States Navy outside of World War II is very, very small.
Even so, the war years saw the Newport Torpedo Station grow in influence, but in the area of mines and depth charges rather than for its torpedo work. It was the Germans who proved how effective torpedoes could be. U-boats sank in excess of 5,000 ships, over 11 million tons. But it would take another world war for the Allies, including the United States, to fully absorb the lessons of that terrible toll. With the Kaiser defeated and the troops back home, the United States once again demobilized. The U.S. Navy consolidated all torpedo design and production in Newport.
And they went off in their own merry way. Even Bliss was out of the business. There was no other torpedo establishment except the Newport Torpedo Station.
The German U-boat campaign was all but forgotten as the United States Navy focused attention on the Pacific and another potential adversary, Japan. As a result, the concept of the fleet submarine was refined. The new submarine would be able to operate in conjunction with the surface fleet and also independently, ranging alone across the vast reaches of the Pacific Ocean. More capable submarines called for a more powerful and long-range torpedo. Drawing on early 1930s experience with a new airdrop torpedo, the Mark 13, the Navy authorized a family of torpedoes based on the same design. The Mark 14 for fleet submarines and the larger Mark 15 for surface ships. All featured steam turbine power, first introduced in the Bliss-Levitt Mark 7.
The motivation for the Mark 14 torpedo was in part to have a faster torpedo. And when you consider that typical targets might move at anywhere in the 10 to 15 knot ballpark, the difference between trying to hit them with a 30-knot torpedo and trying to hit them with a 45-knot torpedo is considerable. Another motivation was a bigger warhead, and even so, they only went to 500 pounds of TNT in the first Mark 14s.
The Mark 14 submarine torpedo was 21 inches in diameter and 20.5 feet long. It had two settings for speed and range, 46 knots to 4,500 yards, or 31 knots to 9,000 yards, or 5 miles. The mechanical parts of these weapons were beautifully machined, but excessively complex.
It was just Newport, and splendid isolation. And I think as a result, the old toolmaker mentality played a big role in some of what they were doing. Many hand-fitted parts. Nobody knew what Newport was doing. They didn't get much criticism. They didn't get much technical feedback.
Facilities were expanded for production of the new weapons, which, to the Naval Bureau of Ordnance, represented the state-of-the-art in torpedo technology. They were especially proud of their new, ultra-secret, magnetic influence exploder. During World War I, the Germans had begun working on a magnetic mine. Upon sensing a disturbance in the surrounding magnetic field, the mine would explode beneath a ship's unprotected bottom, thereby rupturing the hull. The war ended before the device could be tested. The U.S. Navy was intrigued by this new technology and initiated a highly classified program to create an influence exploder for torpedoes.
A 500-pound warhead, a little bit on the light side for doing a lot of damage to ships as they were then being built. And it was generally, I would say, demonstrable that the same charge under the keel would do a lot more damage.
As the magnetic exploder was developed over the following decade, very few people in the submarine community even knew of its existence. Ironically, Britain and Germany were also working secretly on the very same concept.
All three countries had the influence exploder work going on in the back room to increase the effectiveness of the warheads. The effort was so highly classified that on the eve of World War II, the operating U.S. Navy did not know it had an influence exploder for its torpedoes.
The torpedo station had originally requested a derelict battleship to test the new exploder. The Bureau of Ordnance refused, this being viewed, in their words, as unessential.
Navy Department says, no, we can't spend that much money. We'll find another ship. Well, how about an old cruiser? No. A destroyer? No. And finally, they got an old derelict submarine.
On May 8, 1926, amid great secrecy, live war-shot trials against a submarine hulk were undertaken at Newport.
And so they fired 2 torpedoes at it. The first one passed underneath the target and failed to explode. The second one went to the target and exploded and sunk the ship. The torpedo was never tested again because a torpedo cost $10,000. So we went into the largest war that mankind ever fought with a torpedo that had a 50% failure rate. Sounds impossible, but it's true.
In 1933, the cruiser Indianapolis and 2 destroyers were sent on a secret mission to the west coast of South America, along the equator, to test the magnetic exploders on dummy warheads. What was not taken into account were variations in the Earth's magnetic pull.
Problems with the influence exploders, and be they German, British, or U.S., is that the magnetic field of this planet that we're on varies from point to point. So when you try and design an influence exploder that looks at abnormalities in the magnetic field, which is what the ship is when it goes by, these magnetic abnormalities and levels of intensity vary all over the world. The solid scientific base to make an influence exploder did not exist.
Nevertheless, in 1934, the Mark VI magnetic influence exploder was declared ready for production. The position of the Bureau of Ordnance to disallow additional live tests of the magnetic exploder was absolutely clear at the torpedo station. What was not clear, either with the torpedo station or the Navy bureaucracy, was that the Mark XIV torpedo had 2 additional defects. Defects that would obscure the magnetic exploder problem, which continued for most of the war. The first was that the torpedo's conventional contact detonator, which relied on impact, failed to explode under certain conditions. The second was that the depth control mechanism had been incorrectly calibrated. The torpedoes ran too deep. This all would have been made obvious under realistic live fire tests, tests the Navy bureaucrats rejected as too expensive. The priority was getting torpedoes to the fleet. Following Germany's attack on Poland in September 1939 and the increased likelihood of war, the Navy faced a drastic shortfall of torpedoes. Civilian industry was enlisted in the effort, but this created new problems. Torpedoes could not be built like automobiles or tractors.
One thing that most people don't appreciate is that the torpedo is an artisan hand-built weapon. Each torpedo is built, assembled, and proofed. It has a book with it that certifies it. That torpedo is a monolithic weapon. It's not something where you can swap an engine.
Changes to the manufacturing process and minor adjustments and tolerances caused a high rejection rate when the new torpedoes were inspected by the Navy.
They had built a Naval Ordnance Park in Illinois, a Naval Ordnance Park in St. Louis. They hired International Harvester. They hired Pontiac. They had everybody making torpedoes all over the place. Tremendous problems to bring these people up on the line.
When the first reports of possible defects came in, the Bureau of Ordnance and Newport were only too willing to put the blame on civilian production problems. As the submarine sailed into harm's way, the torpedo's design flaws lay hidden. It would be left to the captains and crews of the silent service, not the ordnance establishment, to lead the way out of the quagmire. 2 hours in December 1941 turned an idyllic Sunday morning in Hawaii into an epic nightmare. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. fleet was ordered to execute unrestricted air and submarine warfare against Japan. But U.S. submarines had an inauspicious start. In the first engagement with the enemy, on December 14, 1941, in the Philippines, the USS Seawolf fired 8 torpedoes at a Japanese ship. 7 missed. 1 hit. None exploded.
Bearing mark.
So began the U.S. submarine war in the Pacific. In 45 separate attacks during the first weeks of combat, 96 Mark 14 torpedoes were fired, for a total of only 3 Japanese ships sunk. The most immediate impact of the submarine's poor debut was the failure to even seriously impede the Japanese invasion of the Philippines. Manila fell on January 1st, 1942. 10 weeks later, General Douglas MacArthur fled to Australia. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 was considered the turning point of the Pacific War. But despite the American victory, 18 U.S. submarines deployed as a defensive screen failed to sink a single Japanese warship. Submarine commanders blamed the lack of success on 2 primary causes: faulty torpedoes that ran too deep, and torpedoes that were hitting the target but not exploding.
Fire 1.
There were a lot of reports of deep-running torpedoes, or suspected deep-running torpedoes, because proving that they're running deep is difficult. And the Bureau of Ordnance was saying, well, you guys ain't shooting straight.
You know, in those days, they took an attitude that, well, maybe you're right, maybe you're wrong. And we lost a lot of good skippers of submarines because they were disbelieved. We pretty much, let's say, we 80% believed the sound operator who said, I can hear them hitting the target. So most of what we felt was tremendous frustration. Not only that, we felt that taking such great risk with our own lives for nothing, it was bad on morale.
At Pearl Harbor, Rear Admiral R.H. English sided with the Bureau of Ordnance in placing the blame on the submariners' lack of initiative.
to be commander of the Bureau of Ordnance was very important and was a stepping stone to even higher command to flag rank. So the power of the Bureau of Ordnance and its prestige is one of the reasons not to challenge its favorite submarine weapon, that is this torpedo.
In Western Australia, however, Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood took his submarine captain's complaints seriously. On June 20th, 1942, outside the harbor in King George Sound, in southwest Australia, Lockwood test-fired torpedoes against moored fishing nets. Although more than 800 torpedoes had been fired in combat, this was the first controlled test since 1926. The firings proved to Lockwood's own satisfaction that the Mark 14 was running on average 11 feet deeper than set. Washington ridiculed the test.
The immediate reaction for the Bureau of Ordnance was you didn't have the torpedoes trimmed right. The weight distribution wasn't right.
Furious, Lockwood repeated the test. The results were the same. Finally, the Bureau of Ordnance ordered its own investigation of the depths problem. On August 1st, 1942, almost 8 months after Pearl Harbor, Newport conceded that the Mark 14 depth control mechanism had been improperly designed and tested. But after incorporating the necessary modifications, sinkings did not dramatically increase.
Downscope!
Complaints about premature detonations, erratic runs, and dud torpedoes fell on deaf ears. The magnetic exploder became the primary suspect. Admiral Ralph Christie, who took over command of submarines in Australia when Admiral Lockwood was transferred to Pearl Harbor, adamantly refused to consider magnetic exploder defects. Not surprisingly, Christie had been responsible for its design while in the Bureau of Ordnance. He specifically ordered his submarine crews not to tamper with the magnetic exploder.
When we took a load of torpedoes out, we were forbidden to mess with the exploder mechanism. But of course we did. But they knew that we were doing it, and so they used little tricks. And one of the things they did, when they put in the screws to hold the exploder mechanism into the warhead, they would put little dabs of green paint. Now if you remove that, that paint would be disturbed. Well, we would do this. We would go to the torpedo man in the torpedo shop and say, what color paint are you using on the torpedoes? Well, we're using blue. Now, well, give us a little can of blue paint because we want to take them apart and make them work. And then if we bring them back, we'll paint them up blue again.
The Germans and the Brits both had exactly the same experience. The magnetic exploders, as originally designed, simply were not particularly reliable. They were capricious. Sometimes, especially close to the equator, they would get signals too far away from the ship, and they had prematures.
Finally, in June 1943, Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, ordered the deactivation of magnetic exploders on all torpedoes. But the submarine's success rate did not improve. Instead, the number of torpedo failures seemed to increase. The Bureau of Ordnance, in the meantime, had corresponded with Albert Einstein at Princeton University on a variety of issues, including torpedo detonation. Einstein, who was paid $25 a day as a consultant, quickly understood the problem. The contact exploder's firing pin, located in the warhead, was deforming on impact before it could detonate the explosive. Einstein's immediate suggestion was to add a space at the front of the warhead, providing an additional cushion to absorb the initial shock. The Navy never pursued Einstein's suggestions, and once again, the submariners had to find their own solutions. The torpedo controversy came to a head in July 1943, when the USS Tenosa received intelligence that a large Japanese tanker would pass through her patrol area the next morning.
We fired 4 torpedoes from 1,000 yards. The sound man could hear them hit, but no explosions. And the skipper was about to cry. And the exec on there and myself said, "Captain, this ship is tracking right on course. The speed and course we've got is exactly right." He said, "All right, I'll fire 2 more torpedoes at his stern, and I'll aim them by periscope." But we fired those on a run of 4,000 yards, which is 2 miles. And one missed, and one hit his stern, blew his stern up, and he couldn't move again. So he sat there. We fired over the next 3 hours, 3 to 4 hours, 12 more, one at a time. We fire one side, we go around to the other side. Consternation and frustration extreme.
None of the 12 torpedoes exploded. The Americans were finally chased away by Japanese ships sent to help the beleaguered tanker. Dan Dasby, Tenos's captain, saved his last torpedoes as conclusive evidence that something was very wrong. Now, Admiral Lockwood had to accept that yet another component of the Mark 14, the contact exploder, was also defective. These sheer cliffs on uninhabited Kaho'olawe Island, southwest of Maui, provided the final piece of the exploder puzzle. On August 31st, 1943, as a Navy patrol plane circled overhead, 3 torpedoes were fired against Kaho'olawe's underwater cliffs. The first and second torpedoes detonated. The third was a dud.
A Navy diver went down doing probably one of the most under-heralded and most heroic things that's been done in the course of the war. He went down and put a line on this live warhead that had not exploded, and they fished it up, and then they took the damn thing apart.
Finally, they found out what was causing the trouble. There's a little ring that was just too light, and if you hit it too hard, it would just crush. But if you hit it a glancing blow, it was just right. Well, all they did was make a little change in that, and they turned out a couple on the lathes and tried it out, and they worked like a charm.
Make ready. Tubes 1, 2, and 3.
Make ready.
The problems that had plagued the Mark 14 torpedo since the start of the war had finally been corrected.
Fire 1.
The date was October 1943. The first 2 years of World War II was a frustrating time for the Silent Service. But by the end of 1943, torpedo performance had improved dramatically.
It's hard to describe the feeling that you get when you do sink something. You followed a target and you kept closing in on him for a whole day. And finally, you might make an approach on it, maybe that night. And with luck, you might even get to fire a fish, but you might not. And you might have to start the whole procedure all over again. You might work on it for 2 days, but finally, if you did sink them, all that pent-up tension culminated with that explosion. And when you saw that ship go down, or you heard it go down, when it sunk, you could hear the bulkheads crushing under the sea pressure. Then you felt good about yourself.
During the course of the war, the Newport Torpedo Station delivered over 18,000 torpedoes. Thousands more were made in the private sector. Not only was Newport's monopoly on torpedo production broken, so was its lock on design and engineering. Every new type of torpedo that saw action during the war was developed by commercial companies. One such weapon was the electric torpedo. Unlike the Mark 14 that produced exhaust gases that rose to the surface in the form of a wake, the battery-powered electric had no visible trace, a very desirable characteristic for a submarine torpedo. The new torpedo, called the Mark 18, was contracted to Westinghouse Electric Corporation. It was powered by 72 wet cells, delivering 750 amps, which in turn drove a DC motor.
It was important that all those cells be working, and in those days, our maintenance procedure was to check the water levels when you started, check the gravity of every cell, every one of those 80 cells, and make sure it was up. If we didn't like some cell, then we'd go right into the battery and pull out that cell and put in another one. So we were very careful.
Make ready, tube 2.
In 1944, 30% of the torpedoes fired from submarines were Mark 18s. In 1945, that figure rose to 65%. Westinghouse Corporation's Sharon, Pennsylvania division produced Mark 18s. In a gesture typical of munitions plants, Sharon Division employees periodically worked off the clock without pay for the war effort. One donated Mark 18, torpedo number 58009, was delivered to the Navy on the 9th of November 1944. It was loaded aboard a new submarine, the USS Taranti in New London, Connecticut in January 1945. After arriving in Pearl Harbor, the torpedo was retuned and made ready for Taranti's war patrol. On June 11th, 7 months after they delivered the torpedo to the Navy, Sharon Division workers were informed that their creation had, in the words of Admiral Charles Lockwood, been delivered to Hirohito successfully. That delivery was dramatically illustrated by this periscope photo of a sinking Japanese merchant ship that accompanied the letter. Another product of commercial enterprise and know-how was the Mark 24 acoustic homing torpedo. This was an airdrop torpedo that could acoustically home in on the noise of submarine propellers. It was developed with a specific target in mind: German U-boats operating in the Atlantic. For security reasons, it was called Mine Mark 24, or more commonly, just Fido.
The interesting thing is the absolute stark contrast between the evolution of the Mark 14 torpedo and the evolution of the Mark 24 torpedo. The Mark 14 started in the 30s, and at the end of 1941, it still had a lot of defects in it. The development of the Mark 24 started in December of 1941, and in May of 1943, it sank its first German submarine. Absolutely tremendous. Can you imagine that? Starting from scratch with a totally new concept and ending up with a working weapon that was sinking submarines in 17 months. That's unbelievable.
During the entire war, approximately 15,000 torpedoes of all types were fired. Despite a disastrous beginning, U.S. submarines, while comprising less than 2% of the Navy's wartime commitment, eventually accounted for over 5 million tons of shipping. 55% of all Japanese vessels lost. World War II saw the maturing of one of the most influential weapons in history. It was an evolution that began at the turn of the century, when the torpedo, with gyro control, was transformed into the first guided missile. With the introduction of acoustic homing during World War II, the torpedo became the first autonomous missile. Its success stands as a tribute to those who fought and died beneath the waves during the Second World War. Today, on board the USS Louisville and her sister submarines of the Silent Service, the torpedo, that lethal device of infinite complexity, remains poised, listening, deep in the oceans of the world.
The Second World War's most unusual torpedo was a Japanese model called the Kai-10. It carried nearly 2 tons of TNT and a one-man crew which steered the torpedo. What most models didn't have was an escape hatch for the crewmen, making it the underwater version of a kamikaze attack. There were very few successes, but in the final month of the war, a Kai-10 did sink a U.S. destroyer escort, killing more than 100 American sailors.